The second, probably shorter video dealing with the immigrants in chapter 19. If you want to see what conditions look like, there are a number of photographs in there from 14 to 20. I included a number of photographs by Jacob Riis, R-I-I-S, who came from an immigrant family himself. He lived outside New York City, and I forget for what reason, but one day he went into, accidentally, one of the New York ghettos and was so appalled by what he saw. He spent the rest of his life dedicated to making photographic records of how, as his book was called, how the other half lives, how poor, poverty-stricken people in ghettos actually lived. Most people didn't know. Some of these tenement buildings were even owned by churches who had no idea of the conditions that their renters were living in. So Jacob Riis actually publicized the real conditions of the ghettos. But it's an interesting collection. I particularly am fond of that dead horse picture. Not that there weren't dead horses in the street, there were, but look at the kids next to it. Doesn't seem to faze them at all. My mother, as a child growing up in Chicago, remembered a horse dying in front of their house on the street, and it sat there for days until the city got around to hauling it off. So this is the conditions people lived in. Okay, so what I want to do in this particular video is talk about the reaction by the immigrants and by the community around them. The immigrants come, sometimes they come from villages where they know each other, oftentimes they do not, but they absolutely know that the only way they can get ahead is by sticking together. They come and they settle in ethnic neighborhoods because this is where their stores, their traditional foods are. Number one, their churches are. And we don't, in Texas, we think of race or ethnic group as Hispanic, Black, or largely Anglo. In large cities in the East and in the Midwest, where I grew up in Chicago, nobody would make that distinction. You would say, okay, you're Ukrainian or Norwegian, and the Norwegians and the Finns didn't like each other, and the Swedes and the Finns didn't like each other, and the Greeks and the Italians fought. When I was a little kid, one of the first things I had to learn is you don't go past Clark Street because that's a Swedish neighborhood and they'll beat the crap out of you. So you weren't white, you weren't Anglo, you weren't Caucasian, you were what ethnic group, what country did your people come from? And that's a very strange idea, except maybe in Houston, I think, maybe the only Texas city where that's really prominent. So they stay in ethnic neighborhoods, oftentimes for generations. They marry each other. They have to learn the language since the kids go to schools. By the second generation, they are learning the language. A good example is my own family, where my grandparents were immigrants on my mother's side. My father came as an immigrant. Grandparents were immigrants. He learned English because he ran a little restaurant, a little grill. My grandmother never learned English at all. When she had to do anything, she had to take the kids with her because they had to translate for her. This was common. On the other hand, she had 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls. One had a couple years of college and dropped out. The other 3 all went on to get graduate degrees. The neighborhood I grew up in, Chicago, which was an immigrant neighborhood, first generation, people had come there. I went to school with the kids of immigrants, just like I was. And every kid I went to school with, that I was friends with, it doesn't mean everybody in the high school did, but everybody in my neighborhood got graduate degrees. That was your ticket out of the ghetto. That was your ticket out of poverty. It still is. That's why we're in school today. So what do immigrants do? The first thing they do is they realize they have to help themselves because not too many other people are going to help them. So they create mutual aid societies. Things like insurance clubs. So if you were injured or if you died, the club would step in and take care of your family or pay your expenses until you got back on your feet. Insurance policies. Nobody else was doing this. You had ethnic clubs, ethnic businesses, banks that catered to Ukrainians, grocery stores. This still exists in cities like Chicago, where you can go, there's Greek grocery stores where you can go and get all the stuff you can find in Greece, or Polish grocery stores, et cetera, et cetera. Social centers for their group. Sports teams that were strictly made up of your ethnic group. They even had local militias. In World War I, there were a number of militias from New York City that were German speaking, that didn't speak English, and they had to get German and English speaking officers to captain them. Particularly newspapers. This was a huge thing. It held the community together, and you had a number of newspapers in multiple languages in all these cities. Chicago, it is now online, but up until 2 years ago, actually printed a Greek newspaper in Greek, of course, so that the immigrants could read it. One Yiddish Jewish paper in New York, there were several. One Yiddish paper had a circulation of 250,000 people a day. Nationwide, close to 4,000 ethnic newspapers printed in foreign languages, in most of them, of course, in cities. The church was central to immigrant neighborhoods. The church often ran what they called parochial schools or Catholic schools. And these, again, were nationality churches and nationality schools that often taught bilingually in their own language. So again, if you go back to those maps, particularly the one of Lower Manhattan, it's not just a Jewish neighborhood. It is a neighborhood that is split into Ukrainian Jews and Polish Jews and Spanish Jews and Middle Eastern Jews, because they spoke different languages and had different customs. So it's not just a Jewish neighborhood. It is an ethnic neighborhood as well. So the churches, of course, gave sermons in their own language. So you had a Ukrainian Catholic church, and down a mile away, you had an Irish Catholic church, and then another mile away, you had an Italian Catholic church, because they taught and worked in different languages. For example, 1908, in New York, you had 24 different ethnic Lutheran churches, just the Lutheran churches, and 5,000 different Catholic schools, many of them in bilingually in other languages. If they didn't have enough kids for an entire school, then the churches taught classes after school in the local language. I did not, but I knew many kids who went from public school and went straight to the Greek church because they would get Greek language lessons and dance lessons and cultural lessons, et cetera, et cetera. So this is how they hold their community together. Chicago, 1906, there were close to 1,000 Greeks who took over, and they took over the business, Greek candy stores. It was a big thing. It's a low-level entry business to get into. You don't need much overhead. And that's how many of the Greeks started out in Chicago. And of course, the side benefit of this is if you're making money in America, you send it home to your relatives in Greece who could survive on your salary. Very little intermarriage. For the first, second generation, the Irish married the Irish, the Poles married the Poles. The Irish, well into the 1900s, had a lower intermarriage rate than African Americans, which is hard to believe, but we have the statistics on this. One of the problems was, for a good number of years, it changed later, but if an American citizen married a foreigner, a non-citizen, the American citizen lost his citizenship. So there was a built-in incentive not to marry. What happened was, of course, these people eventually became citizens. So they have to help themselves. There isn't much help coming from elsewhere. The only people that are going to help them are the urban bosses, city politics. Every city in the country was run by one political party or the other. It wasn't all Democrats at the time. And both of the political parties, I'm skipping most of the next chapter, chapter 20, which deals with politics during this period. This is the Gilded Age, so there's a lot of rot underneath. Short story on this, because I'm not asking you to read it, is we talk about political corruption. The Grant administration still beats anything we've had since then in terms of political corruption. Grant, a very honest man, everything around him was totally corrupt. Political parties, there's nothing really to talk about. They were very similar, had similar programs, had similar goals. There wasn't a huge difference between political parties. They both believed in very limited government. They didn't believe in helping people. Remember social Darwinism. You have problems in life, they're your problems. Don't come crying to us, basically. How do you keep the system going? This system was called patronage or the spoils system. In other words, favors for votes, jobs for votes. Government workers, if you got a job through any government, usually the local government, you were obligated or pretty much coerced into paying into local political campaigns. Local politicians had rallies, they had picnics, they had parades, everybody turned out. It's the only show in town, but you were supposed to turn out to vote. The South remains Democratic. Remember, Lincoln was a Republican. The South remains the solid South, remains very Democratic, and the cities were mixed, Democratic and Republican, but they were all run by political machines, we would call them today. Enormous corruption. It makes our period, and we get a lot of corruption too, it makes our period look very honest by comparison. Spoil system basically was the Democratic or Republican Party that controlled politics within a city and oftentimes a state or a region. And that political party would hand out jobs, licenses, you needed help from the police, you needed a street fixed, you needed a street light repaired. You didn't go to the city, you went to your local party boss, your local politician in your part of the city. So let's say South Austin would have a local political party boss, or Oak Hill would have a local political party boss. You needed something done, that's the guy you went to. And he said, sure, I'll get the crew out there, we'll fix that hole in the street, and 3 days later the hole in the street would be fixed. Now, what does he want from you? A little money would be good for the next political campaign, but you're a poor man, you don't have any money, but you do have something he wants your vote. And as soon as those immigrants become naturalized citizens and voters, people take an interest in them. The corruption was massive. It was not unknown for local politicians to stand outside voting places and just hand out fifths of whiskey. More common, you just hand out $10 or $20 bills. And don't forget, our man is John Smith, or whoever it was. They talk about in the textbook the Tweed Ring in New York, which was probably the most corrupt. The 40 aldermen in New York, the 40 representatives from different parts of the city, were called the 40 Thieves. So it was Boss Tweed and the 40 Thieves, like Alibaba and the 40 Thieves. They described what they were doing as, quote unquote, honest graft, honest corruption. It was absolutely corrupt. What was honest about it, at least poor people got something back for the vote. So it was a mutual thing in both directions. This is a local politician in a big city talking about how this system works. And again, he can do it much better than I can. Every time there is a fire in my district, I come running. If a family is burned out, I don't ask whether they are Republican or Democrats, and I don't refer them to the Charity Society, which would get them help just about when they're dead of starvation. I get housing for them, I buy clothes for them, I fix them up until they get running again. It's charity, but it's politics too. Mighty good politics. The poor are the most grateful people in the world. And that quote is also in your textbook, but I've been using this quote for 14 years, long before that version of the textbook was published. The poor are very grateful because no one else is helping them at all. Remember, there is no government regulation. There are almost no social services before 1900. Who is helping them? The local politician for votes. Perfect example of this. First, I grew up with this system in Chicago. Chicago still is probably, from what I hear from relatives, one of the more corrupt cities in the country. And it has been a Democratic city for well over 100 years. The mayor, when I was a kid, was Richard Daley. The mayor up until 10 years ago was his son, Richard Daley II. So we have had a Democratic daily in control of Chicago for about 75 years until very recently. Okay. How does the system work? Perfect example. I know this firsthand. When I was high school, I dated for a while a guy, and he had connections. He got a summer job